Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1127 just came out, and I loved this chapter. A lot of people were a little upset that the pacing went back to being so slow, but to me, this was exactly what I was hoping for when Elbaf started, and this kind of symbolizes Oda's philosophy when it comes to how he begins storylines. So this is something that has actually been very consistent throughout One Piece, which is that often when we're really excited and hyped up for a big upcoming arc, what actually often tends to happen is that Oda always prefers slow starts rather than beginning a storyline with a bang. That has always been his philosophy throughout One Piece. So if you go back to something like Whole Cake Island, that's our whole first conflict with the Yonko straight up, but the beginning of the arc is very slow paced and it's very light adventure with the seducing woods. Similar to Wano, a lot of people were so excited when we first arrived at Wano. What's gonna happen when we get to Wano? What's the crazy stuff that's gonna start happening for the Straw Hats? And instead, Act 1 is a very, very light-hearted adventure with Luffy washing up on the shore, running into Tama, him and Zoro having this little easy breezy dynamic duo where they're beating up Hold'em and getting food back for Leftover Town. Egghead Island, you begin with the Straw Hats, just having fun in the lab, learning about Vegapunk's inventions and everything like that, well before any crazy action begins. And this philosophy of Oda's to always start small and then slowly build and slowball into something much bigger, you can actually see him use that philosophy for the entirety of the story of One Piece on a larger scale. Like, for example, how does One Piece itself begin? Today we know One Piece to be this huge worldwide conflict with all these military factions vying for dominion over the seas. One Piece has probably become the most large-scale manga conflict ever put to paper, but originally One Piece starts off really, really quiet and slow. Like, East Blue is probably the slowest, most calm, simplistic start that you could ever imagine for a shonen series today, and it stretches on for 100 chapters before we finally get to the Grand Line and things start to roll. Similarly, when we get to the Grand Line, we don't begin with some huge crazy conflict like a lot of readers might have expected after all of the talk of the Grand Line. No, it's actually very simple. It's Reverse Mountain with Laboon, then you get a taste of what's to come with Whiskey Peak, which is still a pretty low stakes conflict, and then slowly it builds into Baroque Works and Crocodile and all that. Same with the New World. We've been talking about Fishman Island for so long, we've been hyping up the New World for so long, we hit the New World, and what happens? It's really, really light and simple with Fishman Island. Then we get to Punk Hazard, which is a bit more difficult, then we get to Dressrosa, which is a bit more difficult than that, and things start to get serious, and then from there we get to Whole Cake Island and Wano and all the crazy stuff. So in general, for any storyline, the way that Oda thinks, he always likes to start small, start simple, and then slowly build up to big. That applies to how Oda thinks of the story in the macro scale and the micro scale, how he approaches each arc. So at the beginning of every arc, usually we're coming off of some crazy cool stuff in between the arcs as is, like we just got with, Vigarland Garling being appointed, we just got scenes with Shanks and Blackbeard, so we got some cool stuff in between right after Egghead Island, and we might still cut away to see some cool stuff going on in the outside world, but in Elbaf itself, it's likely we still get a couple more chapters at the very least of some more light, simplistic writing for the Straw Hats without any crazy conflicts or battles or anything like that popping up just yet. So I kind of expected this. I'm really enjoying the fact that we get to start with this, because lots of times I wish in retrospect that we got more time with the Straw Hats just being the Straw Hats, having simplistic, more fun comedy scenes, just more interactions with each other. And so I really feel like it's important to value these sections of the story while we get them, because as the arc progresses and things get more chaotic and more plot elements and more characters start becoming built in, we're just not going to get as much of this. So the chapter itself, there was still one pretty big reveal that we got in the chapter, which I'm going to get to later on in this review, but for the majority of the chapter, it was just really focused on, a little bit of an introductory comedy scene. This whole chapter really was a lot of comedy with gags one after another, lots of jokes, lots of funny running, screaming, reactions, little surprising funny twists and turns, things like that. And this was just, for me, a breath of fresh air, because it has been so long since we just got a full extended comedy scene. Like, Oda still always mixes in gags and jokes into One Piece. It is One Piece after all, but if you go back to pre-time skip, I'm telling you right now, go back to pre-time skip, you can scroll through lots of arcs and just find random scenes where they're just extended comedy bits that last, 10, 15 pages or even entire chapters. Just go back to, Luffy and Sanji carrying Nami up the mountain in Drum Kingdom. Go reread that right now, and you would be shocked at how long Oda just lets a nice, funny, simple comedy scene just play out for an extended period of time. One Piece does not do that anymore. This chapter was the first time in a long time that I felt like we got back to some of that pre-time skip level of just letting things breathe, letting some funny stuff play out for a long period of time, and just letting us get to enjoy the Straw Hat shenanigans without the need to cut away to something else that's more important, and getting the 20 different jump cuts like we were getting in Egghead between scene A and B and C and D and F and Z, you know, like so many different scenes to cut between during Egghead Island, particularly during Vegapunk's final speech. Let's just slow down, enjoy the story, enjoy one scene where we get to see the characters just interact and get some of that old school One Piece feel, One Piece comedy and charm. Love this start for the story, and it feels especially like a throwback, not just in terms of how it's written and the feel of the chapter, but because of the fact that the characters being used in this chapter are the East Blue Five. The East Blue Five, obviously the core crew members that started this whole thing, and seeing this dynamic again, this old school dynamic before we started getting all the newer Straw Hats and before all the additional side characters started, you know, they started taking over the story. Seeing this dynamic getting the spotlight once again, it really reminded me of the charming, simplistic days of East Blue, which, you know, the story's grown way past that, and there's way more interesting elements now than we had in East Blue, but I still enjoy the charm of that dynamic from back then and getting to see them all interacting with each other. Basically, you know, a lot has changed, but basically seeing them still fall into their old tropes, that dynamic of how they all function and interact with each other and the roles that they play in relationship to one another, that has stayed static all throughout One Piece, which is nostalgic to see. You know, isn't it kind of crazy that we've been through 1100 chapters of adventure, we've seen the Straw Hats go through so many battles, train, have a 2-year time skip, become Yonko, take on the world government multiple times, do all of this stuff, and still, if you just set these 5 characters, Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Sanji, and Usopp, by themselves in a scenario, it's gonna play out like this. Usopp's gonna be a coward, Nami's gonna be trying to wiggle her way out of trouble, often relying on others or trying to get them to do her fights for her. Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji are just going to kick ass with their own different attitudes about it. Sanji trying to be a chivalrous hero, Zoro being a stoic badass, and Luffy kind of having fun with it. I just love that we got their whole dynamic that's been a constant throughout the entire story. We see that front and center again, and just a distilled version of what it is at its essence. Now, we do still get a small reminder of how far the Straw Hats have come, because while this has always been generally the dynamic of Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji having an easy time, whereas Nami and Usopp tend to struggle and panic, the difference is that the scale has increased of everything that's happening, right? Because what the Straw Hats have been experiencing is that Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, they've been tearing through Elbaf without having any sort of trouble. Now that is interesting because Elbaf is the strongest nation in the world. Canonically, it's established to be that. And it has by far the largest animals in the world, as we can tell based on how the giants are describing, you know, the ear god, the giant rabbit that was defeated. So we're at a point now where even in the strongest nation on the entire planet with the strongest, you know, base citizen population on the entire planet, the creatures that these citizens, the giants of Elbaf, the great warriors of Elbaf, view as gods, as gigantic creatures so big that when they fall, they basically cause earthquakes throughout the land. For the Straw Hats, that's their fodder, right? Like, the Straw Hats can now basically treat Elbaf like a low difficulty walk in the park. At least the monster trio can. That's how far Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji have come. You know, there was a time at Little Garden where just them seeing the giants the size of Dorian Brogy, that had them in absolute awe because they were so far off from anything like that. Now they can waltz into the nation of giants and basically they are like giants to the giants, symbolically speaking. Like, just think about how big that rabbit must have been for it to have been viewed as a god to the giants, and so big that the giants themselves could not imagine anyone defeating it. And for Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, that's a light snack. So that's really interesting to hear about. Now, the big point that stood out from this chapter, the one key thing that strikes my interest, is the idea that there is some sort of a self-proclaimed sun god on this island already. Now, we know that Nika does not actually exist somewhere on this world, otherwise that would be, you know, much bigger of a deal, right? So there's someone or something masquerading as a sun god on this island. I'm very curious as to who that might be. I think that's going to be a big point of contention. Some people in stream were suggesting that maybe Loki is pretending that he's the sun god. A lot of people have suggested that Loki's storyline may end up connecting to Usopp's storyline in some way. So what do we know about Usopp? Well, Usopp has done this sort of lying and misleading of a nation's citizens in the past. Just go back a few arcs to Dressrosa, where he's telling the Tontadas that he was Usoland, this legendary hero and all of that, and then the Tontadas believed him. So I do think it's possible that, you know, with very little else to work with in terms of like what might actually be going on in Elbaf, I think the one character we know, Loki, trickster. Maybe it's possible that he's claimed that he's a sun god. Or alternatively, maybe the sun god is some actually powerful figure. Who knows? Some people suggested that there's some Skypiea parallels going on here where the Strahds get to a land, they find out that there is some god there, Enel in Skypiea's case, in this case the sun god, and then the god turns out to actually be very powerful in Enel's case, at least relative to Skypiea, you know, the strength scaling of Skypiea at the time. Enel was just broken. So maybe the sun god actually is a big deal, who knows? But I'm, for the moment, gonna lean more towards the sun god being a bit of a trickster figure, maybe Loki, something like that, or the Giants maybe misunderstanding something as a sun god, just because I feel like, unlike in Skypiea, I don't think Elbaf necessarily needs a significant villain, like a significant powerful villain in the island itself, because we have so many other options going on in the world itself right now to draw upon. You know, the Blackbeard pirates could potentially show up here. I do think that the red-haired pirates will be making their way back to Elbaf at some point. Even the kid pirates are sitting around there somewhere. Holy Knights could show up. There's so many possibilities already with the world to work with that Oda set up that I don't think some sort of a false sun god will necessarily be the big bad of this arc. So at the moment, I'm just curious as to where that plot point leads, but I'm not viewing it as a huge deal just yet, so we'll find out very soon. And finally, there's an interesting argument that was made by a member of my Voice of the People, my top tier of patrons. So Nogare says, this chapter is all an illusion from Nami's point of view. There are some weird inconsistencies in this chapter, too many to just write off as Oda's mistakes. Upon first appearing, Luffy has nothing on his back. However, after the attack, there is a sword hilt on his back when he is sitting on top of the cat. Then in the close-up, he suddenly has an axe on his back. Zoro's dialogue also seems uncharacteristic. We all know he isn't the best with finding things. Sanji suddenly wants to eat bugs, even though he has a fear of them. Usopp's bag randomly disappears for a panel and then comes back later. Sanji uses Ifrit Jambe with his right leg, but clearly kicks the cat with his left leg. Luffy's attack is called Elephant Whip, which is a naming scheme traditionally used for Gear 3rd, but this is Gear 4th somehow, question mark. I think that all the Strahds who disappeared are in their own illusions now. The strong alcohol that causes illusions has to be there for a reason, and we're seeing that unfold right now. So I've seen a lot of people mentioning this sort of thing, that there's so many inconsistencies in this chapter, maybe this is a hallucination. For me, the jury is out on that. I think I'm just going to read this and take this as fact, what we're seeing right now. Some aspects of it, for example, the Giants talking in the beginning of the chapter, that doesn't seem to be Nami's point of view. The Giants are really talking about, you know, a rabbit god having been defeated, there being bees and everything falling everywhere around, and that's consistent with what we're seeing is happening with what Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji have been up to. I do think that, yeah, maybe there's a lot more inconsistencies than usual for Oda, but I don't know if that I would go so far as to say that that means that Oda's trying to let the reader know that something is up, and that he's trying to imply that this is all fake. For me, part of it is like, why even write the hallucinations to be like this? I think for me, the biggest reason for that is that we're getting the Straw Hats outfits, as silly as that sounds. We're getting all the Straw Hats outfits kind of debuted right here. So to me, I kind of doubt that we will then cut to the other Straw Hats, because if Nami's imagining what all the other Straw Hats are looking like right now, then I doubt that we'll cut away to all the other Straw Hats and it's revealed that Usopp actually has some different design, Luffy has some different design, Zoro has some different design, Sanji has a different design, so on and so forth. I think that we just got their outfit reveals for the arc, or at least the opening section of the arc. So that might be a very silly reason, but just, you know, the way things kind of came together at the very end, with all the East Blue 5 reunited, their dynamics seeming to be very on point. It felt like almost a meaningful sort of throwback moment, especially with the Alabasta callback, like the trio attack that the Monster Trio did. So I feel like those things are actually supposed to be happening in the story. I don't think this is just stuff that Nami's imagining, because it feels like a good storytelling moment. So the combination of the outfits very possibly being locked in for the rest of the arc, and so therefore Nami is actually seeing what we, the reader, are supposed to be getting as our first time reveals. And then on top of that, just the story moments of the reunion, the throwback to previous One Piece arcs and all of that, and the nostalgia that Oda is invoking. I feel like that is supposed to actually be really what is happening in the story, not just something Nami's imagining. So at the moment, I'd be leaning towards this is real, but I get that the possibility of hallucination is a very decent possibility as well. So I'm on board with that potentially happening. That could lead to some really cool plot stuff and plot twists or reveals. But at the moment, I'm just going to take things as is at face value. Maybe I'm being a dummy like that, but I'm just going to believe that, hey, we got to see all of the East Blue 5 reunited just right here. So that's all for this week's video, and you can watch a video coming out next Tuesday on why I feel like separating the crew like this is going to be so crucial to improving the Straw Hats writing for both groups. So both the East Blue 5 plus Chopper group, and more importantly, the group that has been left on sea. So I think that this is a very, very important move writing-wise for the character writing of the Straw Hats as a whole. So watch out for that coming out next week.